Okay, so you want to own a Formula One team. You picture the paddock, private jets on the tarmac, champagne on the podium, your car's colors flashing past screaming fans at 220 miles an hour, broadcast to hundreds of millions of people in over 180 countries. It looks like the ultimate trophy asset. And the money looks obvious. Just look at the car, every inch covered in sponsor logos, which means someone is writing enormous checks just to put a name on carbon fiber. But here's the part almost nobody outside the paddock understands. A Formula One team isn't really a racing team. It's a global media placement business that happens to go 220 miles an hour. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why that distinction is the difference between the 2 or 3 teams that print money and the 8 others quietly bleeding it every season. Start with what you're actually buying. The car isn't the product, the audience is. Formula One races reach a cumulative television audience in the hundreds of millions across a season, watched in wealthy markets that luxury brands, watchmakers, and airlines are desperate to reach. A sponsor isn't paying for a decal, they're paying for guaranteed screen time across dozens of countries, replayed in highlight reels, associated with an aspirational lifestyle almost no other sport can manufacture. That's why a title sponsorship on a competitive car can run tens of millions a year, and why owning a team is really the business of selling attention wrapped around a race. Here's the number that stops most people before they reach the racetrack. The anti-dilution fee. The grid is capped at 10 teams by agreement among existing entrants, and that number essentially never changes. A new team doesn't just show up, they pay existing teams for the privilege of diluting the prize money pool everyone already splits, a fee set at roughly $200 million before you've built a car or hired an engineer. It exists specifically to keep the grid exclusive, treating a new entrant like a hostile takeover of shared revenue rather than a welcome addition to the show. Once you clear that gate, you're not building a race car company, you're building a mid-sized aerospace firm from scratch. A competitive team needs a wind tunnel, a round-the-clock simulator facility, and a manufacturing operation that rebuilds major components multiple times a season. Modern teams employ 500 to over 1,000 people, most of them specialists just as employable at aerospace giants. Even with the cost cap introduced in 2021, teams can still spend around $135 million a season on car performance alone, excluding driver salaries and marketing, so the real cost of fielding a competitive team is well above the headline number. Now here's the mechanism that makes this business fragile in a way most sports franchises aren't. Prize money isn't distributed evenly, it's tied to where you finish in the Constructors' Championship, and the gap between first and last can exceed $100 million a year. A team at the back earns a fraction of what the frontrunners collect, meaning less money for next season's car, meaning they're more likely to finish at the back again. The richest teams already spend near the cost cap ceiling every year, hire the best engineers away from everyone else, and run more development hours, while the bottom teams are structurally locked into a cycle where performance and funding reinforce each other in exactly the wrong direction. Winning doesn't just win races, it wins next year's budget. Losing starves next year's car before it's even designed. Sponsorship follows the same reflexive logic. A team fighting for podiums attracts premium sponsors paying top dollar for constant television exposure. A team near the back gets a fraction of that exposure, so sponsors pay less or walk away, leaving an even smaller budget to close the gap. Every position on the track quietly sets next year's sponsorship rate card. And there's a talent cost too. Driver salaries sit entirely outside the cost cap, so the wealthiest teams can simply outspend everyone for the sport's best drivers and senior technical staff, further widening a gap the cap was supposed to close. Even engine supply plays into it. Teams that build their own power unit get priority development and integration, while customer teams buying engines from a rival often run a step behind, a gap that has nothing to do with how well either team is actually run. Let's put rough numbers on it. A front-running team might pull in well over $100 million a year in prize money alone, plus sponsorship revenue pushing total commercial income into the hundreds of millions, often exceeding what it costs to run the team. A back-of-grid team might spend a similar amount just staying competitive on paper, but collect a third of the prize money and a fraction of the sponsorship interest, leaving a shortfall that has to be covered by outside investment just to keep operating. Two teams can spend nearly identical amounts building their cars and end the season tens of millions of dollars apart in profitability, purely because of where they crossed the line. A real example of how brutal this gets is Caterham and Marussia, two teams that entered the sport in 2010 as part of a push to expand the grid with lower-cost new entrants. Neither ever finished higher than 10th in the Constructors' Championship. Both spent years collecting the smallest prize money payouts on the grid while competing against manufacturer-backed rivals, and by the end of 2014, both had entered administration within weeks of each other, unable to cover payroll or attract sponsors willing to fund a car finishing last. Marussia was eventually bought out of administration under a different name. Caterham's assets were liquidated entirely. The grid that expanded to welcome them in 2010 quietly contracted back down by 2015, and the promise that a leaner, cheaper team could survive at the back of Formula One turned out to be one of the most expensive lessons in the sport's recent history. Compare that to Red Bull, an energy drink company with no prior motorsport pedigree that bought a struggling backmarker in 2004 and rebuilt it through sustained, patient investment. It took years before results arrived, but the team eventually became one of the most dominant constructors in the sport's history. The difference wasn't luck. It was the financial depth to absorb years of the reflexive funding trap working against them before the flywheel finally turned in their favor. So what does it cost to buy in today? Existing teams have changed hands for anywhere from low hundreds of millions for a struggling backmarker to well over $1 billion for a front-running team with championship history. Building from scratch means the roughly $200 million anti-dilution fee before spending a cent on operations, and most credible new entrant proposals now require backing from automotive manufacturers or investor consortiums deep enough to survive years of underperformance. Very few individuals can realistically self-fund a competitive team, which is why almost every team on the current grid is backed by a major manufacturer, a wealthy energy drink company, or institutional investors. So does owning a Formula One team actually work as a business? In the optimistic scenario, yes, spectacularly. You secure strong technical leadership, finish inside the top half of the grid, control or partner well with an engine supplier, and attract premium sponsors, becoming one of the 2 or 3 genuinely profitable teams on the grid. In the pessimistic scenario, you spend at or near the cost cap every season just to remain competitive on paper. You're a customer team waiting behind a manufacturer's factory squad for engine upgrades. You finish near the back, and you're trapped in exactly the cycle that ended Caterham and Marussia, spending real money chasing a result the sport's own economics have made increasingly hard to reach. A Formula One team isn't really a racing business, and it isn't really a technology business either, even though it looks like both. It's a media rights business wearing a race car as a costume, where your position on the track each Sunday quietly sets next year's prize money, sponsorship rates, and engineering budget, all at once. When you're winning, that flywheel spins in your favor and the economics can look absurd. When you're losing, the same flywheel spins just as hard the other way, and the regulations meant to control costs end up locking you into the position you're already in. The trophies are real, the global exposure is real, but underneath the paddock glamour sits one of the most reflexive, self-reinforcing economic structures in professional sports, and the moment you fall behind on the track, you start falling behind on the balance sheet in exactly the same lap.